was one of those quiet California evenings when the sky turns gold and the wind smells faintly of salt from the ocean. The world-famous actor had just returned from a long day on set. He was tired but calm, enjoying the rare silence that fame seldom allowed him. His family was scattered around the house, his wife reading in the living room, his children playing music upstairs, and 2 dogs stretched out near the patio doors. The home itself was more than a mansion. It was a memory museum, filled with laughter, scripts, photos, and souvenirs from years of travel. As the sun began to sink, a gust of dry wind brushed across the hills. The actor noticed the trees swaying sharply, their branches snapping. A faint smell of smoke reached the porch. At first he thought it was from a neighbor's barbecue or maybe a small brush fire far away, which was common in the late summer. But within minutes the smell thickened and the horizon started to glow an unnatural orange. He stepped outside and saw it, thin ribbons of smoke rising above the ridge. It looked distant, almost harmless, but he knew how quickly fire could travel in this part of California. He went back inside, calm but alert, and told his wife they might need to prepare just in case. They began gathering essentials: passports, photo albums, a few valuables, and the dog's leashes. The children, though nervous, followed instructions. Everyone in the area had grown used to fire warnings, but this time, something felt different. The wind was fast and angry. A few minutes later, the sky darkened with smoke. The golden evening turned into an eerie twilight. Ash began to fall like gray snow. The actor stepped outside again and could hear distant sirens echoing down the valley. Neighbors were already loading cars. Some shouted that the fire had jumped the ridge and was heading their way. He called 911, reporting his address and explaining that flames were approaching the property. The operator sounded calm and told him a crew had been dispatched. He hung up feeling a little safer, trusting that help was on its way. By the time the first fire truck appeared at the top of the street, the flames were already visible from the back fence. The wind carried sparks that landed on dry grass, making little bursts of flame that grew faster than anyone could stamp out. The family had already moved their car to the driveway, ready to leave if things got worse. Still, they hoped the professionals would arrive and contain it in time. But as the fire truck stopped near the property, something strange happened. Instead of rushing forward with hoses and orders, the firefighters seemed to hesitate. The actor could see them from a distance, 5 or 6 figures standing beside the vehicle, talking among themselves. He waved, shouting, "It's spreading fast. Please hurry." One of them looked in his direction but didn't move. Another laughed and said something he couldn't hear. He thought maybe they were waiting for another unit. Maybe they were planning the best angle to fight the flames. Minutes ticked by and the wind carried the fire closer. The heat became unbearable even from the front porch. The actor's wife begged him to get in the car, but he didn't want to leave until he knew help was really coming. Then, to his disbelief, the fire truck's lights flickered off. The crew remained outside, leaning against the vehicle, looking completely unhurried. A few neighbors who had stayed behind started shouting at them too. One woman screamed, "What are you doing?" "The house is burning." But there was no rush, no urgency. The actor could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. These were people sworn to protect, trained to run toward danger. Why were they standing still? Why did one of them smirk when the flames leapt over the back fence? He didn't know what to think, only that every second mattered and they were wasting them all. He ran to the gate and shouted again, his voice cracking from the smoke. "Please, we need help now." One of the firefighters finally moved forward, but waved him off with a dismissive gesture, as if to say it was already too late. The others climbed back into the truck, still not using their hoses. A neighbor captured it all on a phone, those agonizing minutes when the crew did nothing while the fire tore through the property. By the time the family finally drove away, flames were licking the walls of their home. The actor looked back through the car window, watching the place where his life's work and memories were turning to smoke. His wife held his hand tightly. The children were silent, their faces lit by the orange glow behind them. None of them spoke for a long time. They parked farther down the hill with other evacuees waiting and watching. Dozens of families gathered along the road, staring at the skyline that now looked like the mouth of a volcano. Some wept quietly, others prayed. The actor tried to stay composed for his kids, but inside he felt a mix of disbelief, anger, and deep sadness. He trusted the system. He trusted that when you call for help, help comes. But tonight it hadn't. Hours later, when dawn approached, the fire had moved on. Their home was gone. Nothing but the concrete frame and a few charred remains stood where the family once laughed, cooked, and celebrated birthdays. The actor walked through the ashes that morning, not speaking. The air smelled like burnt wood and loss. Reporters soon appeared, asking questions he didn't have the strength to answer. All he could say was, "We called for help, they came, and they didn't do anything." At first, people assumed it was an accident or miscommunication. Wildfires were chaotic and mistakes happened. But the footage recorded by neighbors began to circulate online. The video showed everything clearly: the fire truck parked near the house, the firefighters chatting, laughing, and watching as the flames grew. They weren't trying to coordinate or waiting for orders. They were ignoring a family's pleas. The images were shocking. The world saw them too. Soon, journalists dug deeper and learned the crew had been under investigation before for complaints related to discrimination and misconduct. Several witnesses came forward saying they'd overheard racist jokes from some of those same firefighters during past incidents. Suddenly, the tragedy wasn't just about a fire. It was about something far darker that had been burning beneath the surface for years. The actor, still processing the loss, refused to speak publicly at first. He stayed with his family in a friend's guest house, away from the cameras. They tried to focus on each other, comforting their children who woke up at night crying for the home they'd lost. But as the story grew, so did the anger of the public. People across the country demanded answers. How could firefighters, people trained to save lives, stand by and do nothing? Behind closed doors, the actor replayed that night in his mind over and over. The smell of smoke. The look on the firefighter's face when he asked for help. The sound of his children's voices calling for their dogs. Every detail felt burned into him. He wanted to believe it was just negligence, not hate, but the evidence was too clear. They didn't help because they didn't want to. In the days that followed, social media exploded with discussions about racism in emergency services. Hashtags trended. People shared their own experiences of being ignored or mistreated in times of crisis. News anchors debated whether this was an isolated incident or part of a bigger problem. Activists organized peaceful marches demanding reforms in how fire departments were run and how complaints were handled. Meanwhile, the actor's insurance company sent representatives to assess the damage, but it all felt meaningless. You can rebuild walls and furniture, but you can't replace memories. The scent of a favorite candle, the drawings taped on the fridge, the sound of laughter echoing down the hall. Every item lost was a piece of life that couldn't be bought back. His wife tried to stay strong for the children. "We're alive," she said softly one night as they sat around a small fire pit behind the guest house. "That's what matters." He nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the flames, smaller and safer now, but still carrying the same haunting glow. He thought about the firefighters. What kind of people could look at another human being begging for help and turn away? What kind of hate numbed the heart that much? Days turned into a week. The investigation began. The department issued a short statement calling it a communication failure, but no one believed it. The footage spoke louder than any press release. A whistleblower inside the department leaked more information. Text messages exchanged between some crew members making offensive comments about celebrities, race, and neighborhoods they served. The truth started to unfold piece by piece, and each piece cut deeper. Yet amid all the anger and noise, the actor stayed quiet. He spent his days with his family, helping them process the loss. They volunteered at local shelters for other families displaced by the fires. He wanted his children to see that even in grief, compassion mattered. Still, at night, when everyone was asleep, he would scroll through his phone watching the video again. Each time, his heart ached a little more. He had spent his career playing heroes, characters who fought for justice, who believed goodness always won. But in real life, he had felt powerless in front of the very people meant to protect him. That thought haunted him the most. The night before the first public hearing, he stood outside under a clear sky. The stars were back bright and sharp after weeks of smoke. The air was cold and the silence deep. He thought about speaking up, not for revenge, but for change. What happened to him could happen to anyone. If silence allowed hate to hide, then maybe his voice could bring it to light. When he finally went inside, his wife was waiting by the window. She asked if he was okay. He smiled faintly and said, "I think I know what I need to do." She didn't ask what. She just nodded and took his hand. Far away, the fire-scarred hillside still smelled of ash, but small green shoots were already pushing through the soil. Nature was rebuilding itself quietly, stubbornly, and somewhere inside him something similar was happening, a slow, painful but steady rise from the ashes of disbelief toward purpose. The next morning would mark the beginning of something much larger than a single burned home. It would become a moment the whole country would remember. A story not just about loss, but about how truth can spark change. The morning after the hearing was announced, the world-famous actor woke up before sunrise. He hadn't slept much. The air was cold and quiet, and for the first time in days there was no smell of smoke. He sat by the window of the small guest house they were staying in, watching the light creep slowly over the hills. His wife and children were still asleep, their faces calm after another long night. For a brief moment the world felt still, but inside him, there was a storm. His phone had been buzzing nonstop since the video went viral. Reporters, talk shows, friends, strangers, all reaching out with sympathy or outrage. He hadn't replied to most of them. He didn't know what to say yet. Every time he saw the video again, every time he heard the laughter of those firefighters while his home burned, his heart ached. He wanted to believe people were better than that. He wanted to believe this was just a few bad individuals. But deep down, he knew it went deeper than one fire. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher, the actor received a visit from a woman who introduced herself as a journalist. She was calm, respectful, and spoke softly. She said she wasn't there to sensationalize his pain. She wanted to understand what really happened that night, and more importantly, why. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to open those wounds again, but then he nodded. "If the truth can help someone else," he said, "then I'll talk." They sat on the patio, 2 cups of coffee between them. She asked careful questions: how quickly the fire spread, when the firefighters arrived, what exactly he saw. He told her everything, his voice steady but tired. When he finished, she showed him something that made his heart drop. On her tablet were screenshots of messages from a private group chat between some members of that same fire crew. The messages were filled with mocking jokes, not only about his fame but about his background, his success, and even the neighborhood where he lived. It wasn't just negligence. It was hate wrapped in arrogance. He leaned back in silence, his hands trembling slightly. "So that's what it was," he whispered. "We weren't people to them. We were targets." The journalist nodded. "It's painful," she said, "but the country needs to see this." He agreed, though it broke him to imagine his children growing up knowing that some people could see their father's life as less worthy of saving. By afternoon, the story had spread everywhere. Major news outlets were running it. The screenshots, the footage, the timeline, everything was out in the open now. The department tried to issue another statement, this time promising an independent investigation, but the public was already furious. People were holding signs outside the fire station, chanting for accountability. For the first time in years, the city was united, not by entertainment, not by politics, but by outrage at injustice. The actor stayed home with his family, away from the cameras. But he couldn't avoid seeing the impact. Every time he opened his phone, he saw people marching, crying, and sharing stories of their own. It was heartbreaking and humbling. He never wanted to be the center of something like this, but now that it had happened, he knew he had a responsibility to speak when the time came. One evening, as he was sitting with his wife by the fire pit again, his phone rang. It was the mayor. She sounded sincere and tired. She apologized for what had happened and asked if he would consider meeting with the city council to discuss reforms. He hesitated, unsure if anything they said could really make a difference, but his wife encouraged him. "If not for us," she said gently, "then for the next family." The meeting took place 2 days later in a quiet municipal building downtown. Cameras were kept outside. It was a closed session. The actor, his wife, the mayor, and a few senior officials sat around a long table. The atmosphere was heavy but respectful. The mayor began by saying how deeply sorry she was, not just for the fire but for the betrayal of trust. She admitted that prejudice had no place in public service, and that what happened had shaken her city to its core. Then she asked him what justice looked like to him. He thought for a moment. "Justice," he said, "isn't revenge. It's truth and change. It's making sure no one else has to beg for help while someone laughs in their face." His words hung in the room like smoke. Everyone was quiet. Then the mayor promised to create a review board for all emergency services, one that would look at training, hiring, and internal culture. It was a start. When he returned home, he found his children watching the news. They had seen the protests, the speeches, the faces of people holding up signs that said things like, "Everyone deserves help," and "No more silence." His daughter turned to him and said, "Dad, people care." He smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "people do care. Sometimes it takes something terrible to remind us how much." Days passed and more layers of the story came out. One of the firefighters involved gave an interview of his own, trying to defend himself. He claimed they didn't act because they thought it was too dangerous to approach, but experts quickly pointed out that protocol required at least an attempt to contain or protect property until backup arrived. The excuses fell apart quickly. Meanwhile, the journalist who first spoke to the actor continued her investigation. She found evidence of long-standing complaints from other communities, reports of delays, rude behavior, even false statements in reports. Some of those complaints had been ignored or buried. Now they resurfaced with new force. The country was watching closely. Television panels discussed it every night. Commentators debated what it said about power, bias, and responsibility. Some people dismissed it as an isolated incident, but most knew it wasn't. It was part of a bigger issue, one that went beyond any single fire or city. Through all this, the actor tried to stay grounded. He didn't want to be consumed by anger. He spent his mornings walking with his dogs, his afternoons with his children, and his evenings quietly reading. Sometimes fans sent letters and gifts, paintings, poems, even small donations in his name to local fire safety charities. It reminded him that kindness still existed even in dark times. But there was one night when he couldn't hold back the pain. He sat alone outside watching the stars again, and the weight of everything came crashing down. He thought about the laughter in that video, the casual cruelty. He thought about how easily lives could be dismissed just because of someone's skin, background, or fame. He wiped a tear from his cheek and whispered to the sky, "Why is it so hard for some people to see humanity in others?" The next morning, something remarkable happened. A group of firefighters from another city visited him. They weren't part of the same department. They came on their own time, wearing their uniforms, but without fanfare. Their captain, a woman with kind eyes, stepped forward and spoke gently. "We can't change what those men did," she said, "but we can promise you that it's not who we all are." They handed him a framed photo of their crew with a note signed underneath. "We stand for what's right." It was a simple gesture, but it meant more than words could express. The visit gave him hope again. It reminded him that the story wasn't just about hate. It was also about courage, integrity, and the good people who refused to stay silent. The journalist later covered that meeting, writing about how tragedy sometimes brings out not only the worst but also the best in humanity. A few weeks later, the city held a public forum to discuss emergency service reforms. The actor attended quietly with his wife. The room was full: community members, firefighters, city leaders, and media. When he stood up to speak, the room went still. He spoke softly, but his voice carried. He told them about that night, not as a celebrity, but as a husband and father who watched his home burn while waiting for help that never came. He didn't accuse or yell. He simply shared the truth, the fear, the disbelief, and the pain of realizing that those meant to help chose not to. Then he looked at the crowd and said, "I don't want this story to end in anger. I want it to end in awareness. If even one person in uniform learns from this, if one heart changes, then maybe it wasn't all for nothing." The audience stood and applauded. Some people cried. Even a few firefighters in the back wiped their eyes. It was a rare moment of unity, fragile but real. After the forum, as the actor and his wife walked to their car, a young man stopped them.
He introduced himself as a firefighter in training.
His voice shook as he said, "Sir, because of what happened to you, I'm going to do better. I'm going to be the kind of firefighter you needed that night." The actor smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all I could ever ask for," he said. By now, the investigation was wrapping up. Several of the firefighters involved were officially dismissed, and others faced disciplinary action. But for the actor, it was never about punishment alone. It was about making sure this never happened again. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle slightly. The family started planning to rebuild. Not just the house, but their sense of peace. The actor decided to launch a foundation dedicated to promoting fairness and empathy within emergency services. He wanted to sponsor scholarships for young people from diverse backgrounds to become firefighters, medics, and rescue workers. "If we change who stands at the front lines," he said in an interview, "we change how the world is saved." The public loved the idea. Donations poured in. The foundation quickly became a symbol of hope rising from tragedy. People called it the Phoenix Project, named for the mythic bird that rises from ashes. Through it all, the actor remained humble. He still grieved for what he lost, but he found healing in helping others. The journalist who had first uncovered the truth visited again to do a follow-up story. She asked him how he stayed so calm through everything. He smiled softly and said, "Anger burns fast. Hope burns longer." That quote spread everywhere. It was printed on posters, shared online, and even used in campaigns promoting unity across the country. Slowly, what began as a story of injustice turned into one of resilience and change. One night, as the actor walked alone by the hillside where his old home once stood, he noticed small green shoots pushing through the blackened earth again. Life was coming back just as he was. He took a deep breath and whispered, "We're still here." And for the first time since the fire, he truly believed it. Months had passed since the fire, and the once blackened hills had begun to show signs of green again. Nature was healing in its quiet, steady way. The actor often drove up to the old site in the early mornings before the world woke up. He would park his car near what used to be the driveway and just stand there, listening to the wind rustle through the new grass. The ashes had faded, but the memories were still sharp. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the crackle of flames and the faint echo of laughter that haunted him. But something else had changed too. Inside him. The anger that once filled his heart had softened into purpose. The foundation he created, the Phoenix Project, had grown faster than he imagined. What started as an idea over a dinner table had turned into a nationwide movement. Donations came from ordinary people, celebrities, and even retired firefighters who wanted to be part of something good. One morning, he visited a small training center built with the foundation's help. It was located on the outskirts of the city. Not fancy, not large, but alive with energy. Dozens of young recruits were there, learning how to handle fire hoses, manage rescue calls, and most importantly, work as a team. When he arrived, they paused their drills and clapped. He wasn't used to being seen like that anymore, not as a movie star, but as someone who had sparked something real. A young woman from the group stepped forward to greet him. She looked nervous but determined. "Sir," she said, "thank you for what you've done. My father was a firefighter. He quit years ago because he felt no one wanted change. He says now, because of you, things are finally different." He smiled and shook her hand. "You're the ones making the difference," he replied. "You're building the future I only dreamed about." The moment felt small, but it was powerful. He saw in her eyes the same fire that used to burn in his. Not anger, but hope. Back at home, the rebuilding had finally begun. Architects and designers had offered to help, but the actor told them he didn't want a mansion this time. He wanted something simple, warm, and filled with light. He wanted a home, not a symbol. He asked that part of the land be turned into a community space, a garden and memorial for victims of injustice. His wife loved the idea. Together, they chose trees to plant, benches to install, and a small pond that would reflect the sky. The media still followed him, but his relationship with fame had changed. He no longer sought attention, but when people listened, he used his voice to highlight others. The recruits at the center, the volunteers helping victims, and the firefighters who stood up against discrimination. He gave speeches not on movie stages, but in school gyms, city halls, and community parks. He spoke plainly from the heart, and people listened because his words came from experience, not ego. One evening, as he sat by the garden's half-built pond, his phone buzzed. It was the journalist who had first helped uncover the truth. She wanted to tell him about a documentary she was working on, a film that would explore not just what happened to his home, but the ripple effect it caused across the nation. She wanted to show stories of other families who had suffered from neglect or bias in the system, and how his foundation had inspired reforms. He hesitated at first. The idea of reliving everything again on camera made his chest tighten. But then he realized the story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by it. If it helps people see the change we're making, he said, then yes, I'll do it. The filming took place over several weeks. The journalist followed him to the training center, the city meetings, and even the quiet moments at home with his family. She asked questions that went beyond the surface, about fear, forgiveness, and what it meant to rebuild after loss. His answers were simple but honest. I learned that you can lose everything, he said in one interview, and still have enough left to give. When the documentary aired months later, it broke records. Millions of viewers watched from all over the world. The story of one family's tragedy turning into a movement gave people hope in a time when the world often felt divided. The final scene, showing him standing in the garden beside the new recruits, became a symbol of resilience. In the weeks that followed, letters flooded in again, not just from fans, but from firefighters, teachers, parents, and even children. One letter stood out. It was from a boy in a small town who wrote, "When I grow up, I want to be the kind of firefighter who saves everyone, no matter what they look like." The actor read it aloud to his family, tears filling his eyes. "That's it," he said softly. "That's what all of this was for." But even as the public story shone bright, the private healing continued. Some nights were still hard. There were moments when he missed his old home so much it hurt to breathe. He missed the sound of his kids running through the halls, the smell of his wife's favorite candle, the little things that make a place feel alive. Loss doesn't disappear, he learned. It just becomes quieter with time. One evening he visited the garden alone. The memorial was almost finished now. A plaque at the center read, "From ashes we rise, together." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had once meant fear, but now felt like warmth. As he sat on a bench, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the new fire chief, the woman who had taken over after the scandal. She was known for her honesty and her no-nonsense attitude. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Because of you, we changed how we train, how we hire, and how we listen. It's not perfect yet, but it's better." He looked at her and smiled faintly. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "You did the hard part, the part that really matters." She nodded. "Maybe, but it started with your voice." Then before she left, she added, "We're dedicating our next training class to your foundation. It's our way of saying we're moving forward." After she walked away, he sat there for a long time, watching the pond reflect the first stars of the evening. He thought about how strange life could be, how something that began with destruction had led to new beginnings for so many people. A few days later, the foundation held its first official graduation ceremony for new recruits. The event took place outdoors in the same city that had once been divided by anger. Now people came together, firefighters, families, students, and city officials. There was laughter, applause, and even music. When the actor stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. He looked at the faces before him, young, old, different colors, different backgrounds, and felt a deep sense of peace. "You are the proof," he began, "that out of pain can come purpose. You are what happens when people choose to care." He paused, scanning the crowd. "When my house burned down, I thought I had lost everything. But what I gained was faith. Faith in people like you." The audience clapped, some wiping their eyes. He stepped down, and as he did, a group of recruits came forward to present him with a helmet. It had been polished to a shine, and engraved on the side were the words "Honor, Courage, Unity." He accepted it with gratitude and placed it gently on the podium. "This belongs to all of you," he said. That night, back at home, he sat with his wife on the porch of their partially rebuilt house. The air was warm, the sky clear. In the distance, he could hear crickets and the faint hum of city life. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Every day," he admitted. "But now it feels different. It used to be pain. Now it's a reminder of how far we've come." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You did good," she said softly. "You turned something terrible into something beautiful." He looked out over the garden where soft lights glowed along the path and smiled. "We did good," he corrected. Over the next few months, the Phoenix Project continued to grow. More cities reached out, asking for training, workshops, and guidance on inclusion and ethics. The actor traveled often, meeting with mayors, chiefs, and volunteers. He didn't preach or lecture, he listened. And everywhere he went, he saw small but real changes taking root. In one town, a group of recruits had painted a mural on the side of their fire station, a large phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by hands of different colors reaching upward together. When he saw it, he felt his throat tighten. They understood, he whispered to himself. He returned home that night exhausted but content. His children ran to greet him, their laughter filling the house again. The sound was like music, the kind that fills every corner of a heart. He hugged them tightly and realized that this was the real rebuilding, not the walls but the love inside them. Later, as he stood outside looking at the stars, his wife joined him. "You think it's over?" she asked. He thought for a moment before answering. "No," he said. "I think it's just beginning." He was right. The story was no longer just his. Across the country, people were starting their own Phoenix projects, not just for firefighters, but for hospitals, schools, and police departments. The message had spread. Compassion could be taught, fairness could be built, and empathy could save lives. One morning, months later, the journalist sent him a message. The documentary had been nominated for an award. She thanked him for his trust and told him that what he started had reached millions of hearts. He replied simply, "It wasn't me. It was all of us." On the anniversary of the fire, the family gathered in the garden. They placed flowers at the memorial, lit candles, and stood in silence. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of new blossoms. His youngest child looked up and asked, "Do you miss the old house?" He smiled softly. "Sometimes," he said. "But we built something better, a place where people grow stronger together." As the candles flickered and the night settled in, the actor looked around at his family, his friends, and the volunteers who had joined them. He realized that the flames that once destroyed his world had also lit a new path, one built not on fear or anger, but on hope. And in that moment, under a sky full of stars, he finally felt free. The morning sun spilled through the windows of the new home, touching the white walls and warm wooden floors with a soft glow. The actor stood in the middle of the living room, barefoot, holding a cup of coffee. The scent of fresh paint and new beginnings still lingered in the air. It had taken nearly 2 years to rebuild, not just the house, but everything that had been lost inside him. The garden outside had grown full and green. The trees they had planted were taller now, their leaves rustling gently in the early breeze. The pond reflected the sky like a sheet of glass, calm and peaceful. The actor watched his children chase each other near the garden path, their laughter bright and free. For a long time he had feared that laughter would never return, but here it was again, softer and stronger than before. His wife stepped beside him, smiling. "It feels alive again, doesn't it?" she said. He nodded slowly. "It does. Like the land was waiting for us to believe in it again." The peace he felt now was different from the calm he once had before the fire. This peace came with scars, but also with wisdom. The foundation, the Phoenix Project, had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. It now worked in several cities, training and funding young people from all walks of life who wanted to serve their communities with compassion. They had built partnerships with fire departments, rescue teams, and schools. What began as a story of loss had turned into a network of hope. One afternoon, as he was reviewing updates from the foundation's office, his assistant walked in with a letter. "You might want to read this one yourself," she said with a small smile. It was from a small town in another state. A high school had named their new safety program after the Phoenix Project, and the students had written him messages of gratitude. He opened one from a girl who wrote, "Because of you, I decided to become a firefighter. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. I want to be part of the change." He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on his desk. For a moment, he just sat there, feeling the weight of her words. This was the kind of ripple he had hoped for. Not fame, not attention, but quiet, meaningful change. A few days later, he traveled to another city to speak at a national conference on public safety reform. It was one of the largest gatherings he had ever attended outside of Hollywood, but this time he wasn't there as a celebrity. He was there as a man who had lived through something that forced him to see life differently. The auditorium was packed. Officials, firefighters, medics, students, and journalists filled every seat. As he stepped onto the stage, there was a hush. He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle before he began. "I used to think heroes only existed in stories," he said, his voice calm but steady. "I used to play them on screen. But real heroes don't wear capes. They wear uniforms. They wake up before sunrise. They go where the danger is, and they do it not for fame or money but because someone needs them. He spoke about what happened, but more importantly, about what came after, the rebuilding, the forgiveness, and the countless people who turned pain into purpose. His message was simple. Empathy could save more lives than equipment ever could. When he finished, the crowd stood and applauded for several minutes. Some cried. Others simply nodded, deeply moved. After the speech, people lined up to meet him. A fire captain from another state shook his hand and said, "You reminded us why we do what we do. Sometimes we forget. But hearing your story brought it back." Later that night, alone in his hotel room, the actor stood by the window overlooking the city lights. He thought about how far the story had traveled. From one burned house on a hill to an entire country learning to look at compassion differently. It was humbling. Over the next few months, he continued to travel, speaking in schools, fire academies, and town halls. Everywhere he went, people shared their own experiences, moments when they had been ignored, moments when they had been saved, and moments when they had chosen kindness despite pain. One day, during a visit to a small coastal town, he was invited to meet a family who had survived a fire just weeks earlier. Their house had been saved by a group of firefighters who had trained under the Phoenix Project's program. The family insisted he come to see them. When he arrived, they greeted him with open arms and tears in their eyes. A middle-aged man hugged him tightly and said, "Your foundation saved us. Those firefighters, they came in the middle of the night and they didn't give up. One of them told me, 'We don't watch fires anymore. We fight them.'" That line, it came from your story. The actor felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, his eyes wet. In that moment, everything he had done, the speeches, the meetings, the long nights of doubt, felt worth it. After leaving their home, he sat by the beach, listening to the waves. He thought about how pain can travel through the world like wind, but so can healing. One person's courage could change another's life, and that life could change another and another until the world began to shift, even if just a little. But with growth came challenges too. As the foundation expanded, it drew attention, some positive, some critical. A few voices accused him of using his story for fame or influence. Others said he had exaggerated the tragedy. At first, those words hurt. It was hard not to take them personally, but over time he learned to let them go. The truth didn't need defending. It just needed living. He focused instead on results, the new recruits, the communities that now had faster, fairer responses, the lives saved by those trained in empathy. Those were the answers that mattered most. One evening, while reviewing reports, his wife walked in holding a cup of tea. "You need to rest," she said softly. He smiled. "I know. Just finishing one more thing." She laughed gently. "You always say that." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Sometimes I think I'm chasing something impossible," he admitted. "You're not," she said. "You're building something lasting. It's just hard because it matters." He looked at her for a long moment and nodded. She was right, as always. As the months passed, a national news outlet decided to host a televised event honoring people who had made significant social contributions. They invited him to receive an award for his work with the Phoenix Project. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted the spotlight again, but the foundation team encouraged him to accept. It would help raise awareness and funding. When the night came, he walked the stage not as a movie star, but as a man representing hundreds of others who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The host introduced him with words that touched his heart. He turned tragedy into transformation and taught us that compassion can rebuild what hate destroys. As he accepted the award, he said something that would later echo across social media. "The fire burned my home, but it didn't burn my spirit. And if you keep faith, no flame can take away your humanity." The crowd stood again, clapping for a long time. It wasn't applause for fame, it was for truth, for courage, for the reminder that light can still be found in dark places. In the following weeks, requests poured in for him to collaborate with schools and charities across the world. The Phoenix Project began expanding internationally, working with training centers in other countries. He traveled less now, spending more time at home with his family, but he stayed involved in every decision. He also started writing a book, something he had never done before. Not a memoir of pain, but a guide about healing, unity, and human connection. He wanted to leave something behind that would outlast him. The process was slow but honest. Every page carried pieces of truth, lessons learned from fire, loss, forgiveness, and renewal. As the first draft neared completion, he visited the garden again. The pond shimmered under the afternoon sun. Birds sang in the trees. A group of visitors from the Foundation's latest training program had come to tour the site. He joined them quietly, listening as the program leader explained the story behind the garden. "This place reminds us," the leader said, "that beauty can grow even from ashes." The actor smiled, looking around at the faces, young, eager, hopeful. Some of them weren't even born when his story began, yet they were part of it now. That realization filled him with gratitude. Later that evening, his wife joined him in the garden. They sat on one of the benches, hands intertwined, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if none of it happened?" she asked softly. He thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But then I look at all this, the people, the change, the hope, and I think, maybe it was all supposed to happen. Maybe we had to lose something to find something bigger." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. The world had changed around them, but their bond had only grown stronger. That night, he wrote the final line of his book. "The fire took everything I had, but it gave me back what I needed most, a reason to believe in people again." When the book was published months later, it became an instant success. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Readers said it made them cry, think, and feel grateful. Firefighters, teachers, doctors, and ordinary families sent him messages saying his words had changed how they saw others. One evening, during a live interview, the host asked him what he hoped his legacy would be. He smiled and said, "Legacy isn't about fame or awards. It's about the lives you touch quietly, the people who keep carrying your light forward. If even one person learns to act with kindness when no one is watching, then I've done enough." After the interview, he walked outside into the cool night. The air smelled faintly of jasmine. The stars shone bright, the same way they had the night after the fire years ago. But this time the darkness didn't feel heavy. It felt vast and full of possibilities. He stood there looking up and whispered a quiet thank you to life, to love, and to the fire that had once destroyed everything, but ended up awakening something far greater. The journey wasn't over. It never really would be. But now it wasn't about rebuilding what was lost. It was about building what would last. And as he turned toward the house, where laughter and light spilled through the windows once again, he knew deep down that the world had changed, not because of him, but because people had chosen to care. The morning air carried the smell of fresh rain and blooming jasmine. The world outside the actor's home felt calm, almost sacred, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath after years of noise. The garden glistened under the soft sunlight, drops of water resting on every leaf. The actor stood at the edge of the pond, watching the koi move slowly beneath the surface. Life, he thought, was a lot like this pond, quiet on the outside, full of movement underneath. It had been nearly 5 years since the fire. Time had done what time does best. It softened the sharp edges of pain, even if it didn't erase them. The house was not just rebuilt, but transformed into something more than a home. It had become a gathering place for people, a symbol of healing and a reminder that loss could give birth to purpose. That morning, the actors' team was preparing for a big day. The local fire station, rebuilt and restructured after years of reform, was about to reopen. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a center of training, education, and community outreach. It represented a new beginning, not just for firefighters, but for everyone who believed in fairness, compassion, and unity. As he sipped his tea, his wife walked in with a smile. "They're already setting up outside," she said. "The news crews are here. Everyone's waiting for you." He smiled gently. "It's not really about me," he said. "It's about all of us." She touched his shoulder. "Yes," she said softly. "But it started with you. Don't forget that." When they arrived at the fire station, a crowd had already gathered. Children waved little flags, local residents held signs of support, and firefighters from all backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, wearing the same uniform, united by purpose rather than divided by prejudice. The building itself gleamed with new life, its walls painted in warm tones, its entrance lined with flowers from the community. Inside, a large plaque displayed the station's new motto, We serve every life equally. The actor was greeted by the new fire chief, a kind woman with a calm strength in her eyes. She had worked tirelessly for years to help reshape the department's culture. As she approached, they shared a quiet handshake filled with mutual respect. "It's good to see this day. Finally here," she said. "It's good to see people believing again," he replied. The crowd quieted. As the ceremony began, the mayor spoke first, talking about the long road the city had taken, the mistakes made, the lessons learned, and the courage it took to change. Then it was the actor's turn to speak. He stepped to the podium, looking out over the sea of faces, families, firefighters, students, and neighbors who had all been touched by the story in one way or another. For a moment he said nothing. He just breathed, feeling the weight of the moment, and then began. "5 years ago," he said, "I stood in front of ashes. I thought my world had ended. I didn't understand why something so cruel could happen. But standing here today, I see something different. I see what grew from those ashes, and it's more powerful than any fire could ever destroy." He spoke about how the pain had shaped him, how forgiveness had freed him, and how love, not anger, had rebuilt everything. He reminded the crowd that the story was never about one man's loss, but about what happens when people choose compassion over hate. "Every time we face darkness," he said, "we have two choices, to curse it or to become the light that pushes it away. Each of you standing here chose to be that light." The crowd erupted in applause, not loud or wild, but warm and sincere, the kind that feels like a collective heartbeat. After the ceremony, the new chief invited him to cut the ribbon. Together they held the scissors, a symbol of shared progress, and opened the doors to a new era. The crowd cheered, camera flashes flickered, and in that moment, something beautiful unfolded. A chapter that began with injustice ended with unity. Later that afternoon, the actor stayed behind as people slowly left. The building was quiet now, sunlight streaming through the large front windows. He walked through the hallways, looking at the photographs that lined the walls. Images of firefighters training, helping during floods, rescuing animals, comforting children. Each photo told a story of humanity. In one corner hung a frame with a quote from his own speech years earlier. "The fire took my home, but it could not take my faith in people." He smiled quietly. Life has a strange way of circling back, he thought. As he stepped outside, a group of new recruits were gathering for their first day of training. He stopped to watch them. Young faces full of determination, some nervous, some confident, all hopeful. The chief noticed him watching and walked over. "They're the next generation," she said proudly. "They've read your story. It's part of our training now. We remind them that courage isn't just about facing flames. It's about facing fear and choosing empathy every single time." He felt a lump in his throat. "You're doing something incredible here," he said. "We're all doing it," she replied. Together. After leaving the station, he took a quiet drive through the city. Everywhere he looked, he saw change. Not perfect, not complete, but visible. The walls that once divided people were now painted with murals of unity. Schools had programs inspired by his foundation. Fire departments in other cities had adopted similar training models. The movement had become bigger than anyone could have predicted. He stopped by a small park where a group of children were playing. Some of them wore tiny shirts with the Phoenix Project's logo on them, a rising bird surrounded by flames turning into light. Watching them laugh, he realized something profound. This was the real legacy. Not the fame, not the speeches, but the quiet change in the hearts of those who would grow up believing kindness was normal. He sat on a bench, closing his eyes for a moment. The sounds of laughter mixed with the breeze, and he let himself feel grateful. That evening, he returned home to find his wife setting the dinner table outside under the string lights. The garden glowed softly, and the smell of food drifted through the air. The kids were already seated, talking excitedly about their day. As they ate, his wife looked at him and said, "You seemed quiet today." He smiled. "Just thinking," he said. "About what?" "About how far we've come," he said. "And how far there still is to go." She nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever miss the old life, story before all this?" He thought about it for a long moment. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But then I remember how lost I was back then. I had success, but I didn't really understand what it meant to live for something bigger than myself. Now even the hard days feel meaningful. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one. The world felt slower now, simpler, more real. After dinner, he walked back to the pond again. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, just like it did the night after the fire so many years ago. But this time, instead of seeing loss, he saw reflection of everything that had been rebuilt, everything that had changed. He remembered something his grandmother once told him when he was young. You can't stop the fire, but you can learn to dance in its light. At the time, he didn't understand. Now it made perfect sense. A few weeks later, he received an invitation to speak at a global conference about humanitarian leadership. He almost declined at first. He felt his message had already been shared enough. But his foundation team convinced him to go. When he arrived, he was greeted by leaders, teachers, activists, and first responders from around the world. During one session, he sat beside a young firefighter from another country who had flown in just to meet him. The firefighter said softly, "Your story changed my life. It reminded me why I started this job. I want to serve people with love, not fear." The actor shook his hand, humbled beyond words. When he went up to speak, he decided not to read from notes. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "People ask me how to change the world," he began. "But the truth is, you don't start with the world. You start with one person. You start with one act of kindness, one moment of courage, one decision to forgive instead of hate. That's how fires are put out, one act of humanity at a time." His words were simple, but they carried weight. By the time he stepped off the stage, people were standing, many in tears. That night, back in his hotel room, he looked out at the city lights again. Every journey, he thought, begins with pain but ends with purpose if you let it. Years later, when he was much older, the story of the fire became something people studied in schools. Documentaries were made not about the tragedy itself, but about the transformation that followed. The Phoenix Project continued to grow, led by the next generation. The actor stepped back quietly, choosing to live peacefully, spending his days writing, painting, and enjoying time with his family. On the 10th anniversary of the fire, a small ceremony was held at the same garden where it all began. Friends, foundation members, and new firefighters gathered. They lit candles around the pond, each representing a life touched by the story. The actor didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, surrounded by light, and watched the flames flicker softly against the water. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. A young reporter approached him after the event and asked quietly, "If you could go back and stop that night, would you?" He thought about it carefully. "No," he said at last, "because that night, as painful as it was, gave birth to everything good that came after. Sometimes the fire doesn't destroy us, and it reveals who we really are." The reporter nodded, clearly moved, and walked away. The actor stayed a little longer, watching the candles burn lower, their reflections dancing on the water. He realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in love over hate. As he walked back toward his home, he whispered to himself, "The fire may have burned my house, but it lit a light in the world. And that light will keep burning long after I'm gone." The night was calm, the sky full of stars, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the circle was complete. The story that began with loss had ended with purpose, and that purpose had spread across hearts, across generations, and across the world.